My uncle gave our family business to his son. When I confronted him, he snapped, "Your dad's gone. Be grateful I kept you on payroll." I just smiled and said, "Sure, we'll see about that." Sup, Reddit. Buckle up because this one's intense. If you've never been to Midland, Odessa, picture this. Flat dirt in every direction, pump jacks nodding like tired old men, and enough dust to turn a white truck brown by lunchtime. The whole Permian Basin runs on diesel, desperation, and guys who will answer the phone at 2 in the morning when a generator dies on a lease road 20 miles from the nearest gas station. I'm one of those guys. Or I was, anyway. Now I'm the guy who signs the checks. I'm Jace, 27 male, and for the last 7 years, I've been the backbone of my family's mobile fleet service company. Burnt knuckles, no sleep, and a toolbox that weighed more than most people's furniture. I've slept in the cab of our service truck between midnight callouts with my boots still on because taking them off felt like tempting fate out here. I've changed injectors in horizontal rain at 3 a.m., while a rig foreman stood behind me with a flashlight, chain smoking, and asking every 90 seconds if I was almost done. I've bled on more engines than I can count. The Permian doesn't care about your feelings. It cares about uptime. And I delivered uptime like my life depended on it, because for a long time, I thought my future did. Last winter, a parts order came in wrong for the third time on a job I was already behind on. I threw a wrench across the shop bay hard enough to dent the wall. Mike, our shop foreman, didn't even flinch. He just looked at the dent and said, "Feel better?" I didn't. But 20 minutes later, I was back under that truck finishing the job because that's what needed to happen. What I didn't know was that my uncle had been running a different kind of operation in the office. The kind where my name ended up on documents I never signed. My social security number got used without my knowledge, and my inherited ownership stake got treated like it didn't exist, until I made sure it did. I know. It's kind of confusing. That's why I should give you the full picture first. Briggs Equipment Services was started by my dad, Arthur, and his brother Gerald about 15 years ago. They set it up as an LLC, 50-50 ownership split right down the middle. The idea was simple. Oilfield support companies need their equipment running. Diesel trucks, generators, pump trailers, all the stuff that keeps a job site running. When something breaks in the field, you can't tow it to a dealership and wait 2 weeks. You need somebody on site, fast, with the right parts and the knowledge to get it done. That was our niche. Mobile fleet service and maintenance for the companies that kept the rigs running. My dad built the reputation. He was a mechanic first, a people person second, and a businessman somewhere around fifth or sixth. Arthur Briggs was the guy who'd drive out to a well site in a hailstorm because he told a client he'd be there by 6 and that was that. Clients trusted him because he showed up, did clean work, and never oversold. He was reliable, and in the oil field, reliable is worth more than clever. My uncle Gerald was the opposite. He handled the office side, banking, vendor accounts, insurance, contracts, basically everything that wasn't a wrench. He was smooth, good with numbers, better with people who had money. He wore press shirts to work, while the rest of us smelled like diesel and hydraulic fluid. Gerald could talk to a bank loan officer the same way he talked to a pastor, and you'd believe every word both times. My dad trusted him completely with that side of the business, because my dad hated paperwork the way most people hate traffic. That's why Gerald was listed as the managing member on all the official documents. My dad wanted to turn wrenches, not push paper. Dad died 2 years ago. Heart attack on a Sunday morning. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. I was 25 and suddenly half owner of a company I'd been working at since I was 16. The operating agreement was clear. Dad's 50% membership interest passed to me as his sole beneficiary. The agreement said if a member died, their share went to their heir automatically once the estate stuff was done. Gerald couldn't block me even if he wanted to. On paper, I was Gerald's equal partner. In reality, Gerald acted like I was still the kid who used to sweep the shop floor. The day after the funeral, Gerald pulled me aside in the office. He put his hand on my shoulder, looked me in the eye, and told me the best thing I could do for the company was keep doing exactly what I'd been doing. Stay in the field. Keep the clients happy. Let him handle the business side because that's what Arthur would have wanted. He said it with this tone like he was doing me a favor, protecting me from the burden of responsibility. I was grieving. I was tired. I said, okay. That was my first mistake. I started working for the company the summer after I turned 16. Grunt work at first. Cleaning the shop, organizing inventory, riding along on service calls to learn. By 18, I was handling basic diagnostics on my own. By 20, I was running solo field calls. By 22, I was the guy they sent when nobody else could figure it out. The complicated stuff. The jobs where downtime was costing a client thousands per hour, and somebody needed to show up, figure it out fast, and get it done. My cousin Theo, Gerald's son, came into the business around the same time I did, but Theo's path looked nothing like mine. While I was out in the field getting sunburnt and greasy, Theo was in the office. Learning the business, his dad called it. What that actually meant was Theo sat in on client meetings, went to industry lunches, attended the networking events in Midland, where guys in clean boots talked about margins and market share. He got business cards before he could change a fuel filter. I got a pager and a list of emergency contacts. Theo wasn't stupid. He could talk. He had his dad's smoothness and this way of repeating things he'd heard in meetings like they were his own ideas. He'd drop phrases like operational efficiency and strategic alignment into conversations with guys who had 30 years of diesel grease under their nails. The floor guys would nod politely and then look at each other the second he walked away. There was one week that summed up the whole arrangement. Theo flew to Houston for a 3-day oilfield services conference. The company paid. Hotel, meals, registration, the whole package. He came back with a lanyard full of business cards and a head full of buzzwords. That same week, I pulled back-to-back 16-hour shifts because 2 of our clients had simultaneous equipment failures during a cold snap that knocked out half the generators in the basin. I slept in my truck one of those nights because driving home and back would have cost me 2 hours I didn't have. When we both showed up to the shop that Friday, Gerald asked Theo how the conference went. He didn't ask me anything. Theo spent the next 2 days dropping asset utilization rate into every conversation. One of the older techs asked me what that meant. I told him it meant Theo went to a hotel with a pool. After Dad died, it got worse. Gerald started positioning Theo as the heir apparent to the whole operation, not just his half. Company emails went out with Theo's name on operational updates. Client communications started coming from Theo's account. Gerald introduced Theo at industry events as the next generation of Briggs leadership. Singular. Like I didn't exist. Like I didn't own half the company. The credit stealing got worse as Theo's leadership role expanded. I was in the shop one afternoon when I overheard him on a call with a client who'd mentioned the fast turnaround on a late-night generator repair. His office door was open, and his voice carried. "That's what we pride ourselves on," Theo said, leaning back in his chair like a guy who'd earned the right. Quick response. Minimal downtime. It's baked into our culture. Our culture. No mention of who actually drove 45 minutes in the dark, diagnosed a wiring harness failure by headlamp, and had the unit back online before the morning crew arrived. That was just we. When things went right, it was the Briggs team. When things went wrong, it found its way to my phone. The Permian Logistics situation was the one that really burned. Permian Logistics was our single biggest account, nearly a third of annual revenue, and I'd been their primary point of contact since the day they signed. They had a fleet of service trucks that kept throwing check engine codes, intermittent stuff, the kind of problem that makes you want to rip your hair out because it never acts up when you're actually looking at it. I spent 3 weekends in a row going through their trucks one by one, tracing wiring, swapping sensors, running diagnostics until I finally tracked it to a batch of faulty ECM connectors from a bad supplier shipment. I kept records of everything. My hands were cracked from degreaser by the 3rd weekend. I had connector diagrams spread across my kitchen table at midnight like a guy planning a heist. Wrote up a report with part numbers, failure patterns, and a recommended replacement schedule. Theo took that report to the next client meeting. He presented it as a fleet health analysis he'd been working on. The operations manager, a guy named Dale who'd been calling me directly for years, emailed afterward thanking Theo for his thoroughness. Gerald forwarded that email company-wide with the subject line, "This is what client leadership looks like." That same afternoon, Gerald stopped Theo in the hallway where 3 of us could hear it. He clapped Theo on the shoulder and said, "That Permian Logistics email? That's the kind of relationship management that keeps this company growing. Good work." Theo nodded like he'd just closed a Fortune 500 deal. I was standing 10 feet away with hydraulic fluid on my shirt. Gerald didn't look at me. Mike was beside me rebuilding a valve assembly. He waited until Gerald walked back to his office, then said without looking up, 3 weekends. That's what that report cost you. 3 weekends. I didn't say anything. He wasn't asking me to. Gerald never did any of it where you could call him out directly. The real cuts happened in smaller moments. Once, after I'd landed us a referral from a satisfied client, something that should have been a win, Gerald pulled me aside in the shop hallway. He put his hand on my shoulder, smiled, and said, "That's great, Jace, really. But there's a difference between reliability and leadership. Your reliability, Theo's leadership. Both matter." He said it like he was giving me a compliment. That one stuck with me. The worst instance was during a quarterly meeting I'd actually been invited to. I'd put together ideas for expanding our preventive maintenance contracts, real numbers, projected revenue, client retention data I'd pulled together on my own time. I was halfway through explaining it when Gerald cut me off. He put his hand up, smiled at the room, and said, "Jace, buddy, we love your energy, but you're a wrench guy, and that's a compliment. Let the business side handle the business side." I sat there feeling like someone had just patted me on the head in front of the entire room. Whenever I brought up wanting more involvement in company decisions, Gerald would lean back in his chair, smile, and redirect it. He'd say things like, "Jace, we need you in the field. You're too valuable to pull out. Theo handles the client side. It's division of labor." And it sounded logical, even though the logic was designed to keep me exactly where Gerald wanted me. Useful, invisible, and nowhere near anything that mattered. After that quarterly meeting, something shifted in me. I was still angry, sure. But under that, I started paying attention differently, watching how decisions got made, who benefited, and where the money actually went. And the more I watched, the more I realized that Gerald had spent years building a structure where Theo got the visibility, the credit, and the relationships while I got the callouts, the liability, and the exhaustion. The first thing I did was pull out the operating agreement, the actual document, not Gerald's interpretation of it. I'd barely looked at it after Dad died. Gerald had handled all the estate transition stuff, told me everything was in order, and I trusted him. Stupid. The operating agreement was clear on a bunch of stuff Gerald had conveniently never mentioned. As a 50% member, I could inspect the books. I was supposed to get quarterly financials. I had a vote on major decisions, loans, asset sales, changes to the agreement. I could call a members' meeting, none of which Gerald had ever offered or honored. I started documenting everything. Decisions Gerald made without consulting me, financial statements I never received, every time Theo was positioned as the sole future of a company I half-owned. I kept notes in a composition book I bought at the gas station. Nothing digital that could be accessed from the company network. The first person I talked to was Mike. We were in the shop after hours. I was helping him finish a brake job on one of the service trucks, and I just said it out loud. I told him something was wrong with how Gerald was running things, and I was going to find out what. Mike didn't look up from what he was doing. He finished torquing a caliper bolt, set the wrench down, and said he'd been waiting 2 years for me to figure that out. Then he told me something that stuck. He said the clients didn't call Briggs Equipment Services. They called Jace, and he said my dad would have wanted me to protect what he built, not watch Gerald strip it for parts. Mike was doing his own quiet observations too. Without me asking, he'd been keeping mental notes on things that didn't add up. Vendor prices that seemed high. New suppliers nobody in the shop had ever heard of. Parts orders that came through the office instead of through the normal channels he'd built over 12 years. He told me he couldn't prove anything, but the numbers felt off. I found an attorney in Midland who specialized in business disputes. I showed him the operating agreement, my inheritance documents, and my notes. He looked it over for about 20 minutes and then looked up at me. He told me Gerald had been operating outside the agreement for 2 years. No financial disclosures to me as a member. No consultation on major decisions. No members' meetings. At minimum, I had grounds to demand a full accounting of company finances going back to my father's death. The attorney told me to keep documenting and to request the financial records formally in writing. I sent the letter the next week. Certified mail, return receipt requested. Formal demand for inspection of books and records pursuant to my rights under the operating agreement. Listed everything. Financial statements, bank records, loan documents, vendor contracts, insurance policies, tax returns. I gave Gerald 30 days to comply. Gerald called me that evening. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. He asked why I was sending legal letters instead of just talking to him. Said we were family. I told him I'd been trying to talk to him for 2 years, and he'd been treating me like an employee instead of an owner. I told him I wanted to see the books. That was it. He went quiet for a few seconds. Then he said something I'll never forget. Be grateful I let you work here. We don't owe you anything. Let me work here. At the company my father built, that I own half of. Let me. Gerald, I said, you're going to give me those records. One way or another. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, about 2 weeks after I'd sent the demand letter. I was under the hood of a Kenworth service truck replacing a turbo actuator when my phone buzzed. Kara Whitfield, relationship manager at Basin West Bank. She handled commercial lending for oilfield service companies. Smart, direct, zero tolerance for nonsense. Just confirming some details on the file, she said. You're listed as a key operator on the equipment financing and the revolving credit line. The underwriting references you specifically. I told her that sounded right. I was the primary field operations person. There's also a personal guarantee rider with what appears to be your signature, she said, pledging personal liability for the company's revolving credit facility. Your name, your social security number? I went still. A personal guarantee rider? Correct. Not a staffing form. Not an operational acknowledgement. A personal guarantee pledging your personal assets as collateral for company debt. When was that signed? I asked. She gave me a date from about 18 months ago, 6 months after my dad died. During what Gerald had called a routine bank renewal, the bank had rerun everything after Dad's death to update the account structure, and Gerald played it off like standard paperwork. Kara, I never signed a personal guarantee for anything. The line went dead quiet. I could almost hear her recalculating on the other end. That's noted, she said carefully. I'm going to need to flag this for internal review. We'll need to pull the full submission trail on that document. I'll be in touch. I stood in that shop bay for I don't know how long. My hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. For 18 months, my name had been attached to the company's debt. If the company defaulted, I could be personally on the hook for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And Gerald had done it after my dad died, when he thought I was too grief-blind to notice. I called Kara back within the hour and asked how the guarantee had been submitted. She pulled the file and told me the document had come through as part of a renewal package submitted electronically from the company's main office email. A DocuSign envelope initiated by Gerald's account. My signature block had been pre-populated. The completion record showed the envelope was signed from the same IP address as Gerald's other submissions, not from my phone, not from my email, not from any device I'd ever used. Kara said she was noting all of this. I didn't go home. I drove straight to my attorney's office and waited in the lobby until he could see me. He listened to everything. He said, "That's fraud," and started outlining what we needed to document. Then he told me this changed the entire situation. Forging a personal guarantee wasn't just a breach of the operating agreement. It was potentially criminal, and it gave me leverage. We drafted 2 letters that night. The first was a formal dispute to Basin West Bank, challenging the guarantee's authenticity and demanding they produce the original document plus the full electronic submission trail. The second letter went to Gerald. It wasn't a request anymore. It was a demand. Produce all financial records within 10 days. Acknowledge in writing that the personal guarantee was submitted without my knowledge or consent, and schedule a members' meeting to address my concerns about company management. The letter made clear that failure to comply would result in legal action, including a petition to the court for appointment of a receiver to oversee company operations pending resolution. I also filed a police report, not because I expected them to arrest Gerald tomorrow, but because I wanted it documented. I pulled my credit report that night at my kitchen table at 1 in the morning. Hard inquiries I didn't recognize, new accounts I never opened. I checked for all of it. Came back clean, no surprises. But the fact that I had to sit there scanning every line, wondering what else my uncle might have done with my social security number, was a feeling I wouldn't wish on anyone. Gerald's response came 3 days later. Not compliance, counterattack. He sent a letter through his own attorney claiming that I had verbally authorized him to handle all banking matters on behalf of the company, that the guarantee was standard business practice, and that my sudden hostility was creating operational disruption that could harm the company. He also claimed that my field performance had been declining, and that he was considering whether my continued involvement was in the company's best interest. My attorney read it and actually laughed. He told me Gerald was bluffing. You can't verbally authorize someone to forge your signature on a financial document. That's not how it works. And threatening to remove a 50% owner because they caught you committing fraud? That was desperation dressed up in legal letterhead. We responded by filing a motion for emergency injunctive relief. The motion asked the court to freeze major company decisions, compel production of financial records, and prohibit Gerald from removing me from company operations. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, the bank pressure started building. Basin West's response to my dispute landed in their legal department, and they flagged the company's credit file for internal review. The DocuSign audit trail confirmed everything Kara had told me. The bank placed an administrative hold on the revolving credit line pending full resolution of the guarantee dispute. In banking terms, that meant the renewal couldn't process, and without the renewal, the credit line had a ticking clock. For a company that used that credit line to float equipment purchases, parts inventory, and payroll during slow months, even a temporary hold was bad news. Meanwhile, I stopped working unpaid overtime. No more midnight callouts. No more picking up the phone at 2 a.m. because a foreman was panicking about a dead generator on a lease road. No more covering for gaps in the schedule because Theo couldn't manage dispatch. If a call came in after hours, I forwarded it to the office line. If a job wasn't on my official schedule, I didn't touch it. Everything went through proper channels, documented, time-stamped, by the book. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was working my actual job. Turns out my actual job had been propped up by about 30 hours a week of free labor I was no longer giving them. The systems I'd built had enough momentum to coast for a few days. But coasting doesn't last when the engine stops pushing. By the end of the first week, cracks appeared. A client called about an emergency crane truck repair holding up a pad site. Theo dispatched a junior tech. The kid couldn't diagnose the problem, called Theo for guidance, and Theo couldn't help because Theo had never worked on a crane truck in his life. 4 hours of downtime on a pad site running 5 figures a day. The client called me directly that night. I told him all service requests needed to go through the main office and gave him the number. He laughed. Mike pulled me aside the next day, not to give me a pep talk, to show me something concrete. He'd been watching the internal schedule board. Theo had double-booked techs 3 times, sent wrong parts to 2 jobs, and promised turnaround times that were physically impossible. But the scheduling failures weren't what Mike wanted me to see. He pulled out his phone and showed me a text thread with one of our parts vendors. The vendor rep had asked Mike directly whether the company was going through changes because Theo had told him I was transitioning out of the company and that new operational leadership was taking over. Mike had also heard the same story from a client's fleet coordinator who'd called the shop asking for me. They were already rewriting the narrative, framing my exit as voluntary so nobody asked why the guy who actually ran the operation was suddenly gone, and setting it up so I'd take the blame for leaving instead of them for driving me out. Gerald tried damage control with the bank. He scheduled a meeting with Kara to present a revised credit application removing my name. But removing me didn't just change a form, it changed the risk profile. Without a credible key operator with my track record, the bank's underwriting model looked worse. Theo tried to position himself as the replacement key operator, but his resume was lunches and LinkedIn posts. Kara told Gerald the revised terms reflected the company's current operational profile: higher rate, lower limit, additional collateral. That was banker language for, prove you can survive without the guy you just lost. Because right now, we don't believe you can. It happened on a Wednesday, about a week after Theo's scheduling failures started piling up. Permian Logistics had a hauler, a Peterbilt 389, pulling a lowboy trailer loaded with a Cat 289D skid steer, running equipment from a completed pad site to a new location 40 miles south on 385. The truck's diesel particulate filter flagged a Regan fault 15 miles into the haul. The driver pulled over on the shoulder because the engine was derating, losing power fast. He called Permian Logistics Dispatch. Dispatch called Briggs Equipment Services. Theo took the call. If I'd taken that call, it would have been a 90-minute fix. Senior tech, DPF, specific toolkit. Swap the pressure sensor roadside. Force a manual region. Done. I'd handled that exact job on Permian Logistics trucks a dozen times. I knew their fleet inside out. Theo dispatched Cal, one of the junior techs, but sent him with a general service kit instead of DPF-specific tooling because Theo didn't know the difference. Cal got on scene, couldn't pull the right fault codes without the proper diagnostic software, and called Theo for guidance. Theo told him to clear the codes and try a manual region. Cal couldn't initiate one without the right interface tool. He called Theo back. Theo told him to stand by. That truck sat on the shoulder of 385 for 6 hours. 6. The lowboy was half on the shoulder, half in the lane, just enough to make every trucker on 385 furious. A county sheriff showed up after hour 3, walked up to the driver's window and said, "You've got about 45 minutes to get this rig moving or I'm calling a wrecker. Your choice." Permian had their own wrecker service on standby, but dispatch told the sheriff they were waiting on Briggs to finish the diagnosis before making a call. By hour 4, Cal was standing on the shoulder in a safety vest, waving traffic with one hand and holding his phone with the other, trying to get Theo to pick up. The kid looked like he was about to throw up. The driver called Dale. Dale called Briggs. Theo said they were working on it. Dale called again 2 hours later. Theo didn't answer. Dale called a third time and got the office voicemail. That's 3 calls from your biggest client going unanswered while their truck sits dead on a state highway with a loaded lowboy and a sheriff threatening impound. The skid steer on the lowboy was due at the new pad site that morning for foundation work. The missed delivery triggered a delay penalty clause in Permian Logistics' contract with the drilling operator, $1,000 for every hour past the delivery window. By the time a second tech arrived with the right equipment, it was dark. By the time that skid steer finally arrived the next morning, Permian Logistics was staring at over $22,000 in penalty charges because a DPF sensor job that should have taken 90 minutes turned into an all-day disaster. Dale called me that evening. Not Theo, not Gerald, me. "Jace." His voice was flat. Already made up his mind. "What's up?" I said. "22,000 in penalty charges because your cousin sent a kid with the wrong toolbox to a DPF job," and then stopped answering his phone. He paused. "I've been patient through the slow responses, the scheduling issues, the drop in quality. But this one's done." I told him I understood. Then I told him something I hadn't told any client yet. I told him there was a legal dispute happening at the company, that I was asserting my ownership rights, and that the situation was going to resolve one way or another in the next few weeks. Dale was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "Jace, I don't care about your family situation. I care about my trucks running. You tell me when you're the one making decisions, and we'll talk. Until then, I'm looking at other options." 2 days later, Permian Logistics sent formal written notice. The contract was suspended immediately pending a service capability review with a 60-day termination clause. In the oil field, that's a death certificate. The hearing happened 2 weeks after we filed, right on schedule. My attorney presented the evidence: the forged guarantee, the DocuSign trail, Gerald's failure to provide financial record, the pattern of excluding me from decisions I had a legal right to participate in. Gerald's attorney tried to argue that I was a disgruntled employee trying to disrupt a family business, but the judge wasn't having it. The operating agreement was clear. The forgery evidence was clear. The judge granted a preliminary injunction freezing major company decisions, ordered Gerald to produce all financial records within 14 days, and scheduled a follow-up hearing to address the underlying ownership dispute. More importantly, the judge said something my attorney told me was a big deal. She said the evidence looked like Gerald wasn't holding up his end as managing member, and if he kept it up, she'd consider removing him. When she said that, Gerald looked genuinely scared. The financial records arrived on day 13. My attorney and I went through them together. What we found was worse than I expected. Gerald had been paying himself a management fee that wasn't authorized in the operating agreement. He'd been running personal expenses through the company. He'd signed contracts with vendors owned by people who turned out to be his friends from the country club, at prices above market rate, and he'd been positioning the company to take on more debt, secured by company assets, to fund expansion plans that would have diluted my effective ownership stake over time. The numbers Mike had felt were off. He was right. One part supplier in particular stood out. A company Gerald had switched to about 8 months after Dad died, supposedly for better pricing. The invoices showed prices 12 to 15% higher than what Mike could get from his established contacts for the same parts. I asked Mike to pull the old quotes from his vendor relationships. The comparison was damning. Gerald had cost the company tens of thousands in unnecessary spending, and the supplier just happened to be run by a guy Gerald played golf with. My attorney called it a textbook case of self-dealing and breach of fiduciary duty. He said we could litigate this for years if we wanted to, but there was a faster path. We made Gerald an offer. He could either face a lawsuit that would expose everything he'd done, potentially including criminal referral for the forgery, or he could agree to a buyout. He would transfer his 50% membership interest to me in exchange for a structured payment over 5 years, secured by company assets. Seller financing kept it simple, cheaper for both sides than dragging this through court, and Gerald avoided a fraud referral in the process. He would resign from all company roles immediately. Theo would be terminated for cause based on documented operational failures, and Gerald would sign a release agreeing not to interfere with company operations or disparage the company to clients or vendors. The 5-year payout was manageable because it was structured against projected revenue, and Gerald knew fighting it in court would cost him more in legal fees than he'd ever recover while his dirty laundry got aired in public filings. Gerald tried to negotiate. He wanted more money. He wanted Theo to keep his job. He wanted to be called a consultant instead of being fired. My attorney told him the offer was the offer. Take it or see us in court. His attorney called back 48 hours later. Gerald accepted. The day the paperwork was signed, I walked into the Briggs Equipment Services office as the sole owner. Mike was waiting in the shop. He didn't say anything, just nodded once. That was enough. Theo cleaned out his desk that same afternoon. He didn't look at me. He packed his things into a cardboard box, got in his truck, and drove off. I called Dale at Permian Logistics that afternoon. I told him the situation was resolved, that I was now the sole owner and decision maker, and that I wanted to earn his business back. He said he'd give me one shot. A trial maintenance contract, smaller scope than what we'd had before, but real revenue built on trust I'd have to rebuild. First scheduled service, on time, right parts, 0 issues. Dale sent a one-line email after. That's what I remember. Red Iron Transport, another mid-sized account that had stopped calling, reached out within a month. Their fleet manager had heard through the grapevine that things had changed. Word travels fast in the Permian Basin. The next 6 months were work, real work. Rebuilding client relationships Gerald and Theo had damaged took more than phone calls. Some accounts came back immediately. Others took weeks of consistent service before they trusted us again. A few never came back at all. Not every bridge can be rebuilt. Cleaning up vendor accounts was its own project. Mike and I spent 3 full weekends going through every supplier relationship, comparing prices, renegotiating terms, cutting the ones that had been taking advantage of Gerald's cozy arrangements. Loyalty goes both ways. Base and West killed the forged guarantee once the ownership transfer went through. They took Gerald off all the accounts and put in a rule that any future guarantees needed 2 signatures. Gerald couldn't put his name on a napkin in that bank without someone flagging it now. Getting the credit line fixed up took a few more weeks, this time with real signatures and actual paperwork. Kara told me off the record that she'd been watching the situation and was glad to see it resolved the right way. Mike became my operations partner. He didn't want equity, said he was too old for that kind of pressure, but he wanted a profit share and real authority over the shop floor. Done. We promoted Ruben, one of the junior techs who'd been doing solid work, to lead tech. Cal, the kid who'd been stranded on 385, we parted ways on good terms. He found a shop job in Odessa that was a better fit. We brought in 2 new guys who actually knew Diesel and wanted to learn. I kept the company name, Briggs Equipment Services. My dad built that reputation with his own hands, and I wasn't about to let Gerald's mistakes erase it. I did change the logo, though. Added Est, and the year my dad started it. Small thing. Meant a lot to me. Gerald moved to Houston. Last I heard, he was doing something in insurance sales. Theo's LinkedIn still says Business Development Executive, but there's no company listed underneath it. Neither of them have called me. I'm okay with that. The first time I deposited a check with my name as the sole owner on the account, I sat in my truck in the bank parking lot for a good 5 minutes just looking at it. Some nights I think about my dad. Wonder what he'd say if he could see how it all played out. I like to think he'd be proud that I didn't let Gerald strip the company for parts, that I fought for what was mine, that I protected what he built. Last month, Mike and I sat in the shop after hours going over the quarterly numbers. Revenue was up 15% from the same period last year. Client retention was solid. The bank had approved an equipment line for a 3rd service truck. We were growing the right way. No smoke and mirrors? Mike looked at the numbers and said one sentence, "Your old man would have liked this." That was the best compliment anyone could have given me. Guys, we are so close to hit 100,000 subscribers on this channel. If you are not subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. It really helps hit that 100,000 mark. Thanks for making this dream come true.